The scent of smoke never truly left her. Even now, 20 years later, Clara Lane could still smell the scorched timber in her dreams. The fire had been ruled an accident, but her family never needed a court decision to cast their verdict. She was 13 then, and they said she did it. They never said it outright. Not to the police. But in the years that followed, in the unspoken glances, the uninvited thanksgivings, the whispered warnings to neighbors, they made sure she wore the guilt like a second skin. Now 33, Clara returned to her hometown for the first time in over a decade. Not for a reunion, not for forgiveness, but because the old family home, long abandoned after the fire, was set to be demolished. And they wanted her signature. That's when she decided, if they wanted closure, they were finally going to hear the truth. Clara Lane hadn't seen the old road in over a decade, but its curves still knew her. The gravel popped under her tires like brittle bones as her rental car climbed the low hill where the Lane family farmhouse once stood proud and white, its paint fresh and porch swing creaking with laughter. Now, it sat rotting like a forgotten carcass, roof partially caved, windows shuttered with boards that couldn't keep out memory. The house had burned 20 years ago, and with it, so had everything Clara knew of home. A kitchen fire, they called it. An accident, the papers said. But her family never needed an investigation to pin the blame. She had been 13 then, alone in the hallway when it started, paralyzed by the scent of gas and the crackling sound of something not right. They didn't say she did it, not exactly. But the silence was louder than any accusation. Her mother, Paula, stopped speaking to her with warmth. Her brother Jake looked at her sideways, as if expecting her to combust again. And her uncle Frank, who moved in with them soon after the funeral, made sure the narrative settled like ash in every crevice of the family story. Clara was careless. Clara left the stove on. Clara caused the fire that killed her father. Now she was back, 33, summoned not by nostalgia but by bureaucracy. A letter had arrived from the town council, requesting her signature to approve demolition of the burned-out house. Jake and Paula had already agreed. She was the last holdout. The town hadn't changed much. Still a single diner at the crossroads, still the high school with its boarded-up auditorium, still the same rows of brittle, boxy houses lined with overgrown hedges. It felt like a place preserved not in time, but in the fear of change. Clara parked the car just short of the house. She didn't get out immediately. Instead, she stared at the crumbling chimney that tilted slightly to the left, a crooked spine against the sky. A gust of wind stirred the tall grass, revealing patches of charred earth that had never quite healed. She stepped out, her boots sinking into the wet ground as if the soil itself wanted to hold her there. Inside, the air was cold. Not the chill of weather, but the chill of absence. The front door had been removed long ago, replaced by a sheet of plywood that now lay collapsed on the floor. Clara stepped over it and entered the skeletal remains of her childhood. The wallpaper in the hallway still bore faint blue flowers, edges curled like dying leaves. She traced her fingers along them. This was where she had stood the night of the fire, barefoot and frozen, unable to move. The memory came uninvited, the roar of fire, the sudden black smoke, her father's voice yelling, then cut off. No one ever asked her what she saw. No one asked what she remembered. The adults had sealed the narrative like a coffin, and she had lived inside it ever since. She walked room to room. The living room was almost hollow now, stripped of furniture. Dust settled on the remains of a broken lamp. The staircase to the second floor was missing 3 steps, rotted through, like so much else. She paused at the kitchen threshold. The tiles were cracked and melted near the oven, which still stood rusted in its corner. Black soot reached up the wall like fingers trying to escape. She sat on the dusty floor, resting her back against the wall. This wasn't just a house. It was a graveyard of unspoken things. Her father's laugh. Her mother's silence. The truth. A hawk cried overhead, its shadow skimming across the lawn. Clara stood and brushed off her jeans. There was a meeting at the lawyer's office in town. Jake would be there. Maybe Paula too, though Clara doubted it. Her mother hated confrontation more than she hated her. The lawyer's office was too warm, filled with stale coffee and perfumed civility. Jake sat at the table, dressed in a pressed button-down that did nothing to soften the tension in his jaw. He rose to shake her hand like a business associate. "Clara, good to see you." She nodded, sitting opposite him. The lawyer, a gray-haired man named Whitaker, shuffled papers with the detached air of someone who had seen families at their worst. "We just need your signature to move forward with the demolition and insurance closure," he said. "Everything's in order." Clara looked at the form but didn't touch the pen. "You all agreed without speaking to me first," she said. Her voice was even, not cold. That house isn't just a building. Jake shifted. You haven't lived there in years. No one has. It's unsafe. It's time to let it go. Clara's eyes didn't leave the document. Her name was printed neatly next to the line. Do you remember what today is? Jake blinked. What? The anniversary. 20 years. Today. Silence grew like a crack in glass. Clara stood up. I'll sign when I'm ready. She left the office without looking back. Outside, the sun had begun to dip. The golden hour lit up the town with a kind of nostalgic glow, softening the sharp edges of rooftops and casting long shadows over the street. Clara didn't go back to her motel. She returned to the house. This time, she walked around to the back. The basement door still hung from one hinge. It groaned as she pulled it open, revealing concrete steps swallowed by darkness. She flicked on her phone flashlight and descended slowly. The basement was cold and damp, lined with sagging shelves and rusted tools. In one corner sat an old workbench. Clara approached it, eyes scanning the surfaces for anything, a scrap, a smell, a memory. She paused at a burned patch of floor. Not from the kitchen blaze, this had a different scorch pattern. Smaller. Isolated. Her breath caught. It came back to her, unbidden. That night, she had seen her Uncle Frank arguing with her father near the cellar door. Her father had slammed it shut. Frank had been shouting about money, about debts, about taking care of things. She had forgotten, or buried it. Now it surged like smoke. She backed away, her flashlight catching on something lodged between the shelves, a rusted gas can. Her stomach turned. It hadn't been used in years, but the implication hung in the air like soot. She left the basement without taking it, without taking anything. What mattered wasn't proof. What mattered was memory, hers, finally clawing its way through the years of silence. Outside, the wind had picked up. Dusk had turned to evening. Clara stood at the edge of the yard, staring back at the house as if expecting it to whisper something. But it was she who spoke, not with words, but with decision. She would not sign the demolition papers. Not yet. Not until the truth came out of the ashes. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and microwave dinners. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her phone resting beside her like a ticking clock. She hadn't slept. The rusted gas can, the scorch pattern in the basement, the memory of voices raised in anger, they cycled in her mind with the rhythm of a slow, burning fuse. She hadn't thought of that night in years, not deeply. But now, the details came rushing back with cruel clarity. Frank's voice. Her father's shaking hands. Paula's absence until the sirens arrived. She picked up her phone and searched for the old fire report. The internet revealed pieces she'd never seen, archived articles from the local newspaper, interviews with neighbors. One quote stood out. A neighbor had reported seeing two people leaving the house about 15 minutes before the fire began. The article didn't name names. The fire had been declared accidental. Clara made a list. 3 names. 3 conversations. Her mother. Her uncle. And someone who had lived next door back then, Mrs. Alden. The next morning, the sky was gray with winter breath. Clara drove to the edge of town, where the Alden house still stood behind a sagging picket fence. The garden was wild now, choked with ivy and rust-colored leaves. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and forgotten summers. But the front porch light was on, burning steady through the morning haze. Mrs. Alden answered, cane in hand, posture guarded, eyes cautious. Recognition flickered behind them as she welcomed Clara inside. The parlor was exactly as Clara remembered, floral upholstery, a ticking wall clock, doilies under every lamp, and wallpaper that curled at the edges like pages of a storybook long left unread. Clara explained her visit. Mrs. Alden listened, her expression neither shocked nor indifferent, but resigned. She spoke in a voice weathered by time and smoke-stained memories. She remembered the night. 2 men leaving. One of them Frank. The other looked like Clara's father, but not quite right. Rushed. Shaken. She had told the police, but nothing came of it. They said it didn't match the timeline. Blamed wiring. Case closed. Mrs. Alden's words were slow and heavy. She said sometimes the fire isn't what kills. It's what people refuse to see in the smoke. Clara left with those words echoing through her. Truth, long buried, was beginning to surface. She drove for a while through town, past places that held fragments of childhood. The ball field, now overgrown with weeds, where she once held her father's hand as he taught her how to throw. The corner store with its boarded windows, where she used to buy gum and comics. The streetlight that once flickered above her bike rides home from school. That night had stripped more than timber and wallpaper. It had taken the blueprint of what a family should be, what trust should feel like. The grief of memory settled in her chest like fog, thick and familiar. She remembered the Christmas after the fire, spent in a stranger's foster home with a plastic tree and a quiet kitchen. She remembered the years of stares in grocery aisles, the half-smiles from townspeople who didn't quite know what to believe, only what they were told. By afternoon, Clara found herself outside Frank's auto shop. The same faded red letters above the door. Inside, the air was dense with oil and regret. The sound of metal clinking echoed from the garage bay. Frank looked older, thicker around the middle, more worn than defiant. His hair had grayed at the temples, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for a rag. He saw her. Surprise, then stiffness. He didn't offer a smile or a seat. She didn't need either. Words were exchanged, few and flat. Clara brought up the argument with her father in the basement, the gas can, the debts. Frank denied, deflected, warned. His voice rose slightly, then dropped back into something almost bored. His hands, once skilled with engines, now seemed better suited to fending off ghosts. Clara studied his face for cracks, for weakness, but found only stone and rust. She left him there, surrounded by grease and denial. Outside in the lot, rain began to fall. A light mist, like a baptism. The sky overhead darkened as if pulled by memory. Clara stood still for a moment, letting the rain beat on her jacket, watching it run down her sleeves like sweat or sorrow. She wasn't afraid. Not of Frank. Not of the truth. What she felt now was rage, not loud, but focused. A clear anger that didn't consume but guided. There was only one conversation left. Paula. Clara drove to the duplex lined with flower pots and pleasantries, a beige attempt at reinvention. Her mother answered the door as if she'd been expecting a storm. Her face was older, softer in the way of people who have spent years talking around the truth. Her eyes carried shadows. Her mouth looked like it had forgotten how to smile. They sat inside with tea between them and a chasm of years in the space. The apartment smelled of cinnamon and fabric softener, an intentional warmth that failed to touch the tension. Words passed slowly, meandering through the years, until they finally arrived at the fire. Clara brought up the debts. Frank's plan. Her father's resistance. Paula didn't deny it. Her voice barely carried, a whisper soaked in guilt. She confessed not in declarations, but in fragments. It wasn't meant to happen, she said. A small fire. Enough for insurance. But Clara's father had refused. The situation spiraled. A confrontation. A match. Smoke. Panic. No excuses followed. No pleas. Just silence. The kind that ages the air. Clara stood, absorbing the truth in its full, raw form. Her mother wasn't a villain. Just someone who chose survival over truth. Someone who let silence grow thick as smoke. She looked around the apartment. Framed photos of grandkids she hadn't met. A bookshelf of dusty paperbacks. A life built carefully atop a buried truth. Clara didn't say goodbye. There was nothing more to say. Back in her motel room, Clara opened her laptop. The blank document stared back, and then the words came. A letter, not for revenge, but for record. A story that had been smothered, now revived. She didn't name names, but she told the truth. A fire that took more than walls. A night that dismantled a girl's understanding of family. A silence that lasted too long. She wrote with the steadiness of someone placing stones in a river to cross. She read it aloud to the room. Her voice cracked, and for once, she let it. The sound of her own words felt like bricks being lifted from her chest. She printed the letter, folded it, sealed it. In the morning, it would be mailed. And when the house came down, it would collapse not into silence, but into a truth long overdue. The past hadn't vanished, but now it had a voice. And Clara would no longer be its keeper in chains. She had set it free. The morning Clara mailed the letter, the town was quiet, cloaked in a kind of overcast hush that seemed to match her mood. The mailbox clanked shut behind her, metallic and final. There was no going back now. The truth, in black and white, would find its way to eyes that had never seen her side of the story. She didn't expect retribution or apology, only acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that for so long, she had been the only one still carrying the weight. On her way back to the motel, she noticed the demolition equipment stationed at the base of the hill near the old Lane house. A yellow excavator, silent for now, rested like a mechanical vulture waiting to descend. Orange cones lined the road. A temporary fence had gone up. The house had become not just a ruin, but a target. A place marked for erasure. Clara parked her car and walked toward the site, drawn as if by gravity. The same blackened walls. The same sunken porch. Time hadn't changed its bones, only deepened the cracks. Weeds sprouted from between porch steps, and vines had crept through broken windows, curling through what had once been her bedroom. She stood there a long while, letting the silence settle. Every board, every flake of peeling paint, felt like it carried a voice she had never been allowed to raise. The wind caught the edge of the house's warped roof and made it creak, like a final whisper from the past. She stepped closer, touching the frame of the front door. Her fingers grazed the scorched wood, and for a moment, she remembered the heat, the sound of her father yelling, the frozen fear in her chest, the overwhelming sense that everything familiar was being peeled away by flame. By late afternoon, she received a call. It was Jake. He didn't ask how she was. He asked why she hadn't signed the demolition papers yet. His voice was tense, not angry, but clipped, a controlled tremor beneath practiced detachment. He sounded like someone trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Clara explained that she needed time, that there were things they hadn't discussed, that she had seen the basement, found the gas can, spoken to Mrs. Alden. There was a long pause. Then Jake said he didn't want to dredge up the past, that it was time to move on. But for Clara, moving on meant facing what had been buried, not paving over it. After the call ended, Clara didn't feel anger, only exhaustion. Jake's refusal to look back was a denial of her reality. To him, the past had become inconvenient, an old wound best hidden. But to her, it was a scar that still throbbed beneath every surface of her life. The next day, the town paper printed her letter. It appeared under the opinion section, occupying a full column. The title was simple, A Fire Remembered. She didn't use dramatic language. She simply told the truth, that a fire had destroyed her home, that the silence that followed had destroyed more than just walls, that being blamed for something she didn't do had shaped her life in ways most people couldn't begin to understand. That sometimes, the fire isn't the most dangerous thing. Sometimes it's the people who walk away from it without a second glance. Within hours, her phone buzzed with messages, former classmates, distant cousins, even people she barely remembered. Most said nothing more than, "I read it." Some offered words she hadn't heard in years. "I'm sorry. We didn't know. You were always so quiet." Others admitted they'd wondered, that it had never sat right, that they'd heard things but never asked questions. One woman confessed she had repeated the story of Clara's accident at dinner tables and PTA meetings for years. Jake didn't call again. Neither did Paula. But the silence this time felt different. Less like exile, more like consequence. That night, Clara walked the town. It was colder than she remembered. The street lamps buzzed faintly, casting pale halos onto the cracked sidewalks. She passed the school, the diner, the corner where her father used to wait for the bus. Everything looked smaller. Or maybe she had just grown larger in the absence of lies. She remembered the smell of fire in her hair, the way her shoes had squelched in the mud as the firefighters hosed the smoldering beams, the way Paula had stood still, unspeaking, her arms tight around Jake, the way no one ever asked Clara where she had been or what she had seen. 2 days later, Clara returned to the house one final time. Demolition was scheduled for the next morning. She walked the perimeter slowly, breathing in the cold air, watching the wind stir soot from between the porch boards. The structure was a skeleton of memory now, stripped of everything but the pain it held. She brought with her a box of photographs salvaged from an old drawer at Paula's. Most were yellowed and curled, but a few still held clarity, a birthday party with streamers, her father at the grill, Jake and her building a snow fort. A shot of Clara, maybe 8, blowing out candles with crooked teeth and bright eyes. Back when she believed families stayed whole. She placed them inside the front doorway, not to be saved, but to be buried properly. She also left a note. It wasn't for anyone but the fire itself. Just a few sentences scribbled in quiet defiance. "You took the house. You don't get to take the story." That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the motel window, watching the sky lighten minute by minute. The clouds slowly turned lavender, then pink, before finally giving way to the pale gold of morning. At sunrise, she stood across the road with her arms folded as the machine roared to life. Metal arms tore into wood and plaster, and the Lane house finally collapsed, not with a bang, but a groaning surrender. The porch crumbled first, then the roof, then the walls folded inward like a house exhaling its last breath. Dust billowed into the air, a thick, gray fog that swallowed the skeleton whole. She didn't cry. Instead, she felt something uncoil within her. A tension that had lived behind her ribs since she was 13. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was space, a new absence where shame had once lived. It was the knowledge that while her father had died in that fire, a part of her had, too. And now, at last, she was breathing again. The operator of the demolition machine climbed out and nodded at her. A quiet gesture. No one else stood nearby. No family. No gawking neighbors. Just Clara and the wind and the falling ash. Later, she walked through what remained. Rubble, dust, fragments of plaster and tile. A sliver of a windowsill. The edge of a burned photo frame. She didn't take anything with her. Nothing needed saving. Truth had not rebuilt the past, but it had burned away the lie. And in its place, something like peace had begun to take root. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that acknowledges it and moves forward anyway. Clara turned away from the wreckage and began the walk back down the hill, her step steady, the ground beneath her no longer haunted. 3 months had passed since the house came down. Winter had melted into the edges of spring, and the ground, once cracked and salted, was now soft underfoot. Clara stood on a balcony shaded by the branches of a maple tree in full bud, a coffee cup cradled in both hands. The apartment was small but full of light, with windows that caught the sunrise and a kitchen just big enough for her new routines. She had moved to a nearby town, close enough to stay connected, far enough to breathe. The motel had become unbearable after the demolition. The echoes in those walls weren't her own. Here, in this quiet building with its thin walls and curious neighbors, she had begun to build something again. Peace, ritual, the outlines of a life not shaped by survival. Her mornings started with walks along the river. She took photos of birds and strange clouds, kept a journal, reread old books. She had started therapy again. Real therapy this time, not just coping strategies and worksheets. There were hard days. Days where she doubted the letter, the silence from Jake, the way Paula had disappeared into herself. But there were better days too. Days when the air felt less heavy. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail with a return address she recognized immediately. Jake. The envelope was thick, the handwriting careful. Inside was a note. Brief. Apologetic. He didn't say much. But he admitted to wondering for years. Admitted he had chosen comfort over truth. That he had read her letter a dozen times. That he wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. But someday, maybe. Clara folded the note and set it in the drawer beside her bed. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. But a start. She sometimes spoke with Mrs. Alden, who now called once a week to check on her. They spoke of simple things, the weather, recipes, books. It wasn't a friendship of drama or depth, but of steady kindness, a reminder that some truths were seen, even when no one said a word. One Sunday, Clara drove back to the plot where the Lane house had stood. The lot was empty now, overgrown with grass and clover. A few stones still peeked from the earth. She walked the perimeter slowly, her shoes brushing dew from wildflowers. Near what had once been the porch steps, she knelt and placed a single object into the soil, a small framed photo of her father and herself from that snow fort day. She pressed it into the earth, a quiet gravestone not for a person, but for a truth finally spoken. Clara stood there a long while, not waiting for something to happen. Just being. Then she turned back toward the road, the sun warming her shoulders, her footsteps light. There was no resolution, no perfect ending. But she had something she never had before. A place to stand.